Coming up, the research shedding light on the lives of women in Iron Age Britain.
And I'm having a go at what could be the most back-breaking technique in archaeology.
It's another episode of the Time Team podcast.
Now, we missed a trick last episode, Helen.
Why? What did we miss out?
Do you remember we had Dr. Sophie Hay on from Pompeii? We didn't ask her about stairs. And I need to thank Michael on Patreon for this, because he said in a previous episode, the question came up about stairs versus ladders in Roman villas. And it did, didn't it? And it got us both stumped.
Yes.
Is there anything at Pompeii that sheds any light on this? Asked Michael. And we should have asked Sophie. That was
I know. And I saw the stairs in the programme and I thought, oh, look, stairs, I thought. But then we were just talking about so much and I didn't seem to manage to shoehorn it in, and I should have asked her when we were talking about the fact that hardly anybody does the analysis of standing buildings in the Roman world and how extraordinary her PhD was that it tackled that. That's when I should have said, where are the stairs?
Well, fear not, Helen, because I have got an answer for us, because I emailed Sophie with this exact question, and she has very kindly, this is hot off the press, this email back. So this is the ultimate answer now to stairs. This is going to put our question about whether the Romans used stairs and how we can prove it to bed. In Pompeii, says Sophie, we have plenty of evidence for stone-built staircases, often supported by an arched structure. We have staircases within properties, but also ones that lead up to an upper floor directly from the street. A good example from within a house is the House of Menander, that has a flight of stone stairs with a landing leading to the upper floor. In other cases, the stairs are made of wood, and we either see evidence for the attachment of diagonal wall brackets that supported the stairs, or a series of horizontal slots rising up along a wall into which wooden steps would have been inserted. We know they had ladders too, so should never rule out the possibility of accessing upper rooms by simple removable ladders, certainly in less grand properties. So there is evidence of not just stone staircases in Roman housing, but also wooden staircases as well. We know that they used them.
Hang on a second though. We know that they used them in 1st century Italy. But I'm concerned still about stairs in Roman Britain. And the issue, I think, here is that there's lots of stairs in excavated medieval buildings, and there are very few in excavated Roman buildings. My question now, I suppose the next question, because with archaeologists there's always a next question, is it to do with preservation? Can Sophie see her stairs because Pompeii and Herculaneum have such incredible preservation? And it is true that we have a lot of standing medieval buildings that we can compare, and we have no standing or very few standing Roman buildings in Roman Britain to compare. So what I would like to do now is have a quick look through Sophie Hay's PhD, look for the evidence of stairs in Pompeii, and then try to apply that back to Roman Britain.
I think we are a little bit closer, and my thanks to Sophie. If you missed the conversation, the very wide-ranging conversation we had, it's on the last episode, but if you go to Patreon right now, you can see the discussion in full. It went down very, very well, and you can watch it over on Patreon. Right now, though, here on the podcast, we like to give you a bit of an insight into the various different archaeological techniques that exist, how they work, and why they're used.
And coring is a great way to look back through time at layers of earth that are built up over hundreds or even thousands of years. And the great thing about coring is it doesn't require hugely expensive equipment to take a sample. Just long stretches of hollow metal pole and quite a bit of brute force, as Martyn's been finding out by jumping in a test pit with Time Team's Henry Chapman.
Hi, I'm Henry Chapman. Normally I'm doing survey and digital things, but I also do a lot of coring in the work I do. And what coring is basically just taking a core. So using, it could be handheld equipment or it could be mechanised in various ways. But what you're trying to do is just get a profile. Yeah, in the same way as archaeologists look at different layers to understand a site, the stratigraphy. It's just doing the same thing, but normally over a longer sequence, but just through a single little hole. So so you end up with you're basically taking a column of sediment. So you shove some sort of head which captures the sediment on the end of a pole, and you sort of shove that into the ground and take it out in increments, and record what you're seeing in each times you pull it out, then going deeper and deeper. And then when you construct all those things, it gives you the different layers as you would an archaeological site.
I like how manual it is in a world full of LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar. You're having to do a lot of work here.
No, it is very manual. I mean, there are even the sort of mechanised methods. They're still very, very manual.
It looks like a terrifying piece of equipment, this big long pole with this sort of claw-looking thing on the end.
It's sort of medieval, isn't it?
It's a little bit looks like a sort of piece of torture equipment. But when you put that into this hole, and we can see this little hole in the pit that we're in at the moment, you've put that coring in, taken out a sample. What are you looking for in that sample?
With this sort of thing, you're purely looking at what the different layers are like. So you're looking for different changes in colour, texture. You might have clays, you might have sand, silts, and those sort of things are going to give you a broad indication of what the environment's like. So that's the first thing you're doing. But the other thing you might be doing is assessing, by looking at those sediments, deciding what their preservation might be like. It allows you in archaeology to make an informed decision before you start spending time, money and so on in terms of processing and analysis. So certain sediments are better for preserving. Peat is great for preserving all sorts of things, for example. So you'll get those sorts of ideas from that too.
What are some of the hazards of coring? Bad back?
Bad back is one hazard. I mean, the other thing is lightning.
Really?
Not because it's metal rods. So if there's any lightning, you don't core.
So don't do it in a thunderstorm.
The other thing is, as you go deeper, obviously everything becomes heavier, so you have to start taking all the rods apart and dismantling as you go. They're the big ones, but yeah, it's watching your back as much as anything.
That is so great to hear how coring's actually done, because it produces this huge, great kind of sausage of soil, a bit like the kind of core that you would get out of a cheese tasting thing, except of course you can't eat it, however delicious it looks. And if you're lucky, say you're coring something like, they did 4 metres of peat recently at Wickham Fen in Cambridgeshire, and they've got pollen, insect remains, snail shells, there's been bits of plant, wet wood. There was even some prehistoric bog oak in the Wickham Fen cores. So it's perfect for looking back through the environment over really deep time. And we are actually hoping to do some really deep coring down by the river at Sutton Hoo this summer. And I know what I want to get out of it, but I've always been quite hazy on how it's done. So I was really pleased to hear all the detail and those lovely background noises, Martyn. You always record the most lovely little noises whenever you go out and about. And I think that if I was watching somebody coring, I wouldn't actually even notice those lovely kind of squelching and clinking noises that you got, because I'd be so distracted by everything else. But on a podcast, I mean, that is the beauty of podcasts, isn't it?
It is. You would be distracted, I must say, by probably Henry's face, because he's putting so much effort into it. He's like, and that's what you'd be looking at, because you really have to give it a bit of welly, especially when the soil is, is not kind of wet and mushy and kind of easy to go through. How important then are coring samples when you're on a site? I'm just wondering, is this sort of something that you would, you take a coring at every site you go to, or is it just for specific and occasional ones?
No, it's for specific ones. You need to have a question that or you hope could be answered by coring. And generally you take a lot of cores in a line to pick up a difference. So one of the things that we want to do at Sutton Hoo is to try to reconstruct the shape of the edge of the estuary in Anglo-Saxon times. So we want to know where all the little creeks were that have now disappeared and where the original edge of the river was. And one of the things that it's really great for doing is to reconstruct a landscape, both the topography and the environment, before it's all just kind of covered in modern ploughing. So it kind of mentally can be used with all sorts of other remote sensing techniques to strip off that modern layer and to get back to something that's underneath. But of course, places like, an urban excavation or the middle of a common that's having a housing estate put on it, you wouldn't have a question that you need to answer with a core. So it's really in specific times and places, and you always call in a specialist to do it. And that's why I know so little about it.
This is the Time Scene podcast with Martyn Williams, Dr. Helen Geek, unearthing the world of archaeology. And whenever you learn about history, I find you learn an awful lot about what the men were doing, less so about the women, Helen.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Sometimes you get the feeling that all history books have been written exclusively by men. If you look at the older ones, you get the kings and the emperors and the sultans and the caliphs and so on. And you get the feeling that men have invented everything and they've apparently done all the work. They fought the wars, they hunted the animals, etc., etc. And obviously this is clearly rubbish. But I like to feel that it's archaeologists that have redressed the balance somewhat, because we've always known that daily life consists of men and women. But of course, seeing the evidence isn't always particularly easy. And in my field, in 7th century burials, you often get, sometimes, particularly at the end of the 7th century, you get far more rich female burials than you do rich male burials. And so most of what we're saying about society at the time, archaeologically, is actually about women, because they're so visible. But there are arguments between people who say that, well, this is simply a rich family. This is a rich man expressing his wealth through his wife, almost like a kind of trophy wife, And then other people saying, no, these women who are buried looking as if they have wealth and power probably really do. They're people like Hilda, the Abbess of Whitby, or Baltilda, Queen of France. I could give other names, but they tend to be completely unpronounceable, like people like Athelborough and Athelthryth, who are also running monasteries. We know that they're there from the history. Why shouldn't they also be there in the archaeology? And why shouldn't their stories be just as important? But as always, these are still debates, and we always need more evidence to be able to see the picture more clearly.
And that's exactly what we're getting. Researchers are beginning to lift the veil on the lives of women in Iron Age Britain, and they're using DNA backed up by decades of archaeology to do it.
Yes, and we've got Rachel Pope from the Department of Archaeology, Classics and Egyptology at Liverpool. Rachel, welcome to the podcast. I understand the University of Liverpool is celebrating a bit of a birthday.
It is, yes. We are in our 120th year. Yes, we've been doing method and practice in archaeology for a very long time at Liverpool, and it's lovely to be able to celebrate that.
Yeah, well, long may that continue. Let's talk about this research then, and the use of DNA to tell us more about the role of women in Iron Age Britain. What's been discovered?
Well, this is actually not the first time this has been discovered. So last year, there was a piece of research in Germany that also showed patterns of matrilineal descent.
And what does that mean? Sorry, matrilineal.
It means that if you're looking at a cemetery, that you're seeing descent patterns through the female line. The women stay, and perhaps the men are leaving the group to find partners elsewhere.
So that's kind of the opposite of what we tend to reflexively think is, or automatically think is going on in the past, isn't it? Where you inherit your father's surname, the wealth of a family often goes down the male line. This is different in the Iron Age world then.
Yes, and I think what's surprising is that people are surprised by this, really. Society, it's not a fixed entity. We have, in prehistory, very different types of social norms now coming to the fore. We are beginning to see new things in the aDNA evidence, and it's challenging us to think about why we would expect, patrilineal norms throughout time. It's allowing us for the first time to be able to see how people are related to one another in a burial community. So we're beginning to get insights into social organisation, and in particular kinship patterns that we simply haven't had the science to do that with previously. And it's very exciting, really, to be seeing the archaeology to some extent being confirmed now by the hard science. So, yeah, it's very exciting indeed.
So do you think it changes our ideas about Iron Age society, or does it just give us that kind of more depth and nuance and knowledge to be able to reconstruct their worlds more accurately?
I think if you read a textbook from 40 years ago, the sorts of things that we're finding now in the science would be 180, a complete turnaround. We now, through osteology, are recognising that some women in the late Iron Age period were actually active combatants, and we think in a couple of cases against Rome. The
name Boudica swims into focus immediately, doesn't it?
Yes, and that's the really interesting part, because if we look at the classical texts, they're absolutely full of instances of powerful women, of women leaders. They haven't been really pushed to the fore, and it's only an extreme case like Boudica where we do know about her because it was such a tale in the classical text. But actually the texts are littered with examples.
So Rachel, paint a picture of a typical day for a woman in Iron Age Britain. What would life have looked like?
If you'd asked that of somebody 30 years ago, I'm sure they would have talked about roundhouses and grinding grain and that sort of thing, and created a picture of 1950s Britain, but with roundhouses instead of 1930s semis. So it's quite difficult when we remove kind of historical or ethnographic analogy from archaeology and want to talk about a past that is actually constructed from evidence rather than how we believe it might have been according to kind of romantic narratives that we have received. So I'm not sure I could do everyday life for a woman yet.
But isn't that exciting, though, that actually we sort of don't know? What we thought we knew could be a load of nonsense.
Yes.
And yet again, with a conversation that we have on Time Team, we find ourselves left with more questions than we had at the beginning of the conversation. But we've enjoyed the journey, and
Absolutely.
I think we've learned a lot. So, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on and sharing those discoveries and sharing the research that you've been working on. And happy birthday as well to the University of Liverpool.
Thank you very much. We all look about 120, so it's apt, I think.
Time Team is just like a big extended family, and we love catching up and reminiscing about sites we've worked on in the past and some of the great times we've had in remarkable places up and down the country over the years.
Yeah, let's head to the other side of the world now and speak to two familiar faces to viewers of Time Team. Brigid Gallagher was one of our archaeologists and our principal conservation expert from the Channel 4 days. Her husband, Raysan al-Kubaisi, was also part of the original Time Team as a 3D graphic artist and architectural designer. Hello to you two in New Zealand.
Hi, how are you?
Well, I'm fine, Bridge. It's really lovely to see you both.
So, Bridge, how did you get into Time Team in the first place? What was your route to it?
There was no specific route to it. I happened to be working in Bristol. Time Team was a lot smaller. There was Mick down there at the University of Bristol. Tony Robinson was down there. Of course, Phil was close by. Kerry was close by. So they were just looking for some fresh faces, I think in about 2000 perhaps. And they said, hey, would you like to come along and meet them? So yeah, that's all it was.
What about your favourite memories from Time Team? I mean, it's always tempting to go for the evenings and the parties, but maybe something from the actual day job, and then something from a party.
The evenings and the parties blur together. That's the problem.
I think that's that is what it was. It was an immense amount of fun, and there was a great group of people that were enthusiastic about archaeology and history and putting that out there to the public. there was always a very easy option for people to go, oh, she's from New Zealand. Oh, she's a young archaeologist. Oh, she wears revealing tops, which I look back now and see some of the episodes and I think, oh my goodness, what was I thinking? But obviously, sort of nonchalant. It was a sunny day. I was hot. We'd get to a site and we'd start doing the work and then they'd go, oh, you do know what you're doing, don't you? As though I'd been plucked out from somewhere just as a face or a body to put in there. And we would turn up on site. Us field archaeologists, the young ones, we weren't told anything about the project. It was going to be 3 days and we were all there and only survived because we were really good field archaeologists. Each and every one of us had something about us. We could be put in a trench with no knowledge except for we're looking for a Roman bathhouse on the shoot, or, we're looking for some Georgian footings. And really that was about it. And we were kind of just under the wonderful tutelage of Mick, with Phil there, who just has a wonderful second sense for field archaeology. We were able to take that evidence, no matter how small, and find something fantastic. Even if it was small, it just was a great contribution to the archaeological record.
And Raysan, how about you?
I think my viewpoint's slightly different. I think because I wasn't from an archaeological background, I'm a fan of history. I'm a fan of architecture. I found myself in places and around things which I probably never thought I'd ever be in contact with. I got thrilled. I got a little bit of goosebumps, yeah? It's awe-inspiring. It's great. It's just such a brilliant way of understanding history and hearing those stories.
How often do you come across pit dish carvings? The Isle of Man. I mean, you were in the Isle of Man, weren't you?
Yeah. That was unbelievable.
Wasn't it? I mean, the building remains and the burials, absolutely phenomenal. There on a golf course.
Yes, and that moment we lifted up the covering stone and saw that piece of hair, the plait of hair. The preservation of that was so... I mean, it's a moment that I will never forget. And none of us will ever forget the Ogham carving on that site as well, the Ogham inscription. I can't read Ogham. I'm a runes person. I phoned up Catherine Forsyth, who is the great Ogham person. She told us what it said, and I explained it to the nation while unfortunately holding it upside down.
Oh, what a classic moment.
I know.
It's those moments which just live with you forever, I think.
Yeah.
That was probably the worst televisual moment that I had, because by that stage I'd been to Cardiff University and done my conservation degree and had become the principal conservation expert. And I was the one responsible for lifting the hair and with cameras at all angles. And I could literally feel my hands shaking. And I kept saying to them, can you see my hands shaking? And, there was eyes. I think you were probably right next to me. If you see one of those bits of the plait start to move, you've got to let me know. It was pretty scary stuff.
So many memories of amazing discoveries in amazing locations. Let's talk a little bit about the stuff that happened when the cameras stopped rolling as well, because we've alluded to the evening shenanigans. What are some of your standout moments of that?
Luckily, I have an ability to forget what happens afterwards. But obviously, we do have a child.
Yes, because you two got together on Time Team, and you're not the only couple. I think that's why they call it the Time Team family, because there are, lots of children.
Quite literally, in some cases.
Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, Bella, she's 17 and a half now.
No.
And she had her first birthday at the Welsh City site. It was Kenwyn, and that was her first birthday. We're on that shoot. She walked on her first birthday across the hotel room. And that night, we all had a most fantastic party, didn't we, in the bar? She'd gone to sleep in the pram somewhere over here. Emma had bought a caterpillar birthday cake, and we all ate caterpillar birthday cake for Bella and cheered her. She was asleep in the corner.
So nice.
And so she had a family for about 18 months where she got passed from person to person. We were the only ones with a child, and she just Yeah, she thought everyone was her family.
It's a shame that she doesn't remember it, because I think it was a great start. And we realised, actually doing that anything was possible with the child.
And does she want to be an archaeologist?
God, no. Do you know what, though? She's been so vehemently against what we do. And then she's just passed her AS level history, and now she's doing A-level history as well. So
there's hope for her.
It's possible, but I'm going to try and deter her, I think, a little bit.
But anyway, I mean, in New Zealand, what is archaeology like in New Zealand? Because you've got the arrival of the Maori in, what is that, about 1300 AD?
I think the earliest dates down the bottom, top of the South Island, maybe the late 1200s, probably, the mid to late 1300s. The waka come off the east coast of Polynesia and then into the east coast of New Zealand and land at various places along the coast,
It's like hill forts, a lot of hill forts.
Yeah.
They call them pa here. And then we've got the sort of transition period into colonialism. I find that quite interesting because it's a period which is still in people's sort of couple of generation memories, and the stories have been passed down. So there's quite a lot of association with it. People aren't valuing it enough yet. But in another 50 years, they're going to realise how valuable it is.
Yeah, I mean, so you had James Cook come in 1769 on the Endeavour, and then you start seeing from 1769 the slow trickling effect of sealers, whalers, traders coming in from the States, from the UK. They slowly settle until we've just had Waitangi Day yesterday, which is when the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti or Te Waitangi, which is the crown document that Queen Victoria and Māori chiefs signed to form a bicultural partnership within the country, which, as you can imagine, has not gone, the way everyone planned or thought it would. And to this day, we're still, living through the consequences of that and the misinterpretation of Te Reo Māori language and the English translation. So they're still juggling that fact. But what we have is these amazing conversations that you can see in an archaeological sense between Māori who had no influence from the outside world, and then the introduction of that and the implementation very quickly of nails, blankets, pipes, alcohol. They really very quickly come into those sites as, a lot of the colonial countries do have. Jamestown had a similar kind of material culture. But what I really love about it is that what you can see sometimes is that you've got a black bear bottle and somebody is treating it as though it's obsidian, which is the main tool, the main material used by Māori for cutting, shaping, could be doing tāmuko, tattoos, everything in life. It's essentially the knife of the Māori world. And so you start seeing, we've got this thing that looks like black bear bottle. Can we also treat it in the same fashion? So, you're starting to look at real minutiae stuff, but it's fascinating. It's not obvious when you first go to a site, but then you start seeing that this communication is happening and learning. But, it is interesting.
What a fantastic conversation. And it's so interesting and so brilliant to catch up with the two of you. Thank you so much for coming on the Time Team podcast. Now, you joined us, didn't you, for the relaunch of Time Team back in 2022. Might you be popping this way again at some point?
We would love to. I would love to have come to Sutton Hoo and have a look what was going on this year. But, if someone wants to say Brigid and Raysan need to be at a site, we'll probably be there. But at the moment, we've got a few things we have to do over here.
And to be honest, we've got two teenage daughters and... To be honest, our best friend is Visa.
They've both got into rowing in a big way, and one of them is going to be in Malta. And she's going over there as part of a New Zealand secondary school contingent to build those relationships that occurred after the Gallipoli landings in 1914. And most of the Māori Battalion, the New Zealand's, the Anzacs, all got taken to Malta for R&R and hospitalisation. And so she's off to Malta. So she'll be an hour away. So if anyone fancies going to look up Tallulah in Malta and Easter, she'll be over there, and you can give her a hug and she can pass it back.
Well, and keep us posted on Tallulah and the rowing, because we will be needing rowers for the reconstructed ship. I'm trying to make a note of all the young, strong rowers that, with a bit of training, could switch from modern rowing to early medieval rowing.
And well, both of our girls now are people ideally suited for that, definitely.
Thanks so much, Brigid and Raysan, for coming on the podcast. It's been lovely to see you.
So nice to see you, Helen.
And meet you, Martyn.
And meet you, Martyn.
Oh, that was great. Really, really interesting to catch up with them. Okay, it is time for Patreon questions now. Thank you so much if you've submitted them. If you haven't done it before and you're just thinking, oh, there's this thing I really wanted to know about archaeology, why don't you ask Helen the question? You can do it on Patreon right now. Go there, sign up, join us, and comment on the post about this podcast and ask your question. Here comes one from Irene. This is Irene Daly, who says, this is a Pompeii question. Going back to the conversation we were having in the last episode with Dr. Sophie Hay. During the eruption, which came first, the ash or the pumice? This is interesting. And I suppose this is a question that I've been thinking about as well. And it kind of extends on from Irene's question, which is, what is the best material for preserving anything, right, for doing archaeological study? Because peat is really good, we know, because we've seen these amazing bog bodies in the peat. The pumice is obviously very good because all you have to do is scrape it and you get this beautifully preserved pot or table or whatever it might be. So answer Irene's question, but then answer mine too.
Well, I must say that Irene's question is not an easy one for an archaeologist who isn't used to working in Pompeii, at any rate, to answer, because I have literally never had to engage with volcanology before. It's not something that we are taught at university. All I have been able to find out or work out is that Pompeii is clearly a very much more complex place than most of us, I think, have ever imagined. So all the walls of the city and the trees and the vegetation and the hedges and all the things like that, they must have created an enormous number of microclimates, so that some places were much hotter than others. Well, the walls would have been a barrier to the city filling up. And Pliny the Younger writes a letter describing the eruption. He writes a couple. And in one of them, he tells us that the ash was darker and denser the closer to the volcano that you were. And so I was wondering if that might fly further. But he also tells us the debris was piled up against the outside of houses, a bit like being snowed in. And his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who died during the eruption, he only left his house when he was about to be trapped inside by the pumice. Inside would have been very different to outside, because it's all building up against these barriers of the walls. And the room in which the lady wearing the gold jewellery with all the furniture was excavated in Pompeii had no pumice in it. That was just these much finer, darker layers. I have to say that with my level of knowledge, I can't answer that question, but it does seem like rocks were raining down to begin with, because Pliny describes people who are escaping actually literally tying pillows over their heads as protection. And then later on, it was this kind of finer ash which blocked out the sunlight. But that is me as a completely uneducated archaeologist who knows nothing about volcanology and doesn't know an awful lot about interpreting ancient Roman letters from philosophers either.
Well, maybe we need to get Dr. Sophie Hay on again. I think there's
Absolutely.
so much more that we can talk to her about, and we've discovered that just over the course of this podcast.
Yes.
What's the answer to my question then when it comes to excavating in various different soils or whatever it might be? What's the best for preservation?
Yes, well, the word that you can use if you don't feel happy with using soil, because pumice is obviously not a soil, and
No, that's
really
I
is
was
peat.
trying to think of what it is.
It's the word that is sometimes used is matrix, which
Oh.
is not a great word. It's used for too many things. But yes, what is the best matrix to disinter your archaeological site from? Well, weirdly, it's something that is quite hostile to life. So something like peat that's waterlogged. The way in which peat works with the waterlogging is that there is no rot, because rot, bacteria and so on, require oxygen, which is what you don't get if it's waterlogged. So pumice also doesn't have anything that you can live in. If you're a plant or a worm or a fungus or something like that, it's inert. It's inhospitable to life. And what I would add into this group is sand. I think blown sand covering an archaeological site, which is what happened to the Anglo-Saxon settlement at Weststow in Suffolk, which was preserved absolutely beautifully and which you can visit a reconstruction of today. That was all blown sand, and it's something like that where you don't get plants growing with the roots that will mess up your deposits, you don't get worms with worm action, you don't get burrowing badgers to go after the worms. Something that's not your nice rich plough soil. That's what you want an odd matrix. So to speak.
I didn't think I'd ever hear that phrase, or now they'll understand what it means. Yes.
Matrix. An odd matrix without soil. Yes.
And now I understand. Great question, by the way, Irene, on the eruption as well. So thank you for that. Let's just have one more because we are running out of time. It comes from Jenny Lambert, who says, "How do you cope with muscle soreness when you all dig?" It's a good point. I spent quite a while at Sutton Hoo just standing at the side and watching people, and it was blisteringly hot on the day I visited, and people are hunched over, you're sort of scraping away, and you're doing it for hours and hours and hours on end, and I think, why don't you all need quite intensive chiropractors or what? Do you know what I mean? It looked back-breaking.
Yes, and well, there are a couple of ways that you cope. The most important thing to learn right at the beginning is you must pace yourself. You have to find the pace at which you can work, and you've got to keep to that pace. And if you're working in a group like a troweling line at Sutton Hoo, you have got to somehow, as a group, it's like singing in a choir. You have to work out between the group of you how you can all work together. So the slowest person has got to keep up a bit, and if the fastest person is going too fast, they've got to drop back a bit, or they've got to expand their width, so they're doing maybe 1.5 meters, and the slower person is maybe doing 3/4 of a metre or something.
It kind of reminds me of, when there's a big police investigation and they're looking for something in a field and they all line up and they walk very slowly, but they all walk in a line. And I sometimes think, well, what's the point of staying in the line? Because you're all going to make it to the other end of the field. But there is a reason, is there, why you would stay in a line? Yes,
you have to stay in a line so that you can make sure that the overlaps, the edges, are not leaving a gap. You need to act in concert, in a way, to make sure that you're covering exactly what you need to cover. So you have to learn to pace yourself, and each person is going to do that differently. And the other thing, I'm afraid, is that there's a kind of natural dropping out of people who can't physically do the things that perhaps some other people can. And I remember one of the last big commercial projects I worked on was the Easingwold bypass in Yorkshire in the 1990s, and I was shovel scraping all day to do a rapid evaluation of the areas of the bypass that hadn't been looked at in detail. And that involves shoveling the tiniest little layer off the top as you go, and it creates a lot of vibration coming into your arm. And after a couple of weeks of this, I realised that I had a very sore, I had tendonitis in my arm, and I coped with the rest of it by basically having my arm in a sling for the weekend to allow it to recover. And then it could just about cope with the week. And after that, I thought, well, actually, this is unsustainable. I can't do shovel scraping for weeks on end anymore, or maybe I never could. But this job will have to be done by somebody. It's just not going to be me. So the extraordinary physical specimens like Phil Harding, who's out there in all weathers, on all kinds of site into his 60s, he has A, learnt to pace himself, and B, he has been very lucky.
Yeah, that's it. He's like an elite athlete,
yeah,
isn't he?
He is. And the rest of us have dropped out, sadly, and spend our time doing cushy things, sitting on a chair indoors.
I don't know what you're talking about. Jenny, brilliant question. Thank you very much. That is about it for the Patreon questions for now. But as Patreon members, you do get to ask Helen whatever you like, really, for a future episode of the podcast. So go to Patreon now, patreon.com/timeteamofficial, comment on the post about this podcast and ask your question on a future edition.
And that's about it from the podcast. Don't forget to hit follow so that you never miss an episode. And why not recommend us to a friend who'd be fascinated by archaeological discoveries and the world beneath our feet?
We'll catch you next time on the Time Team podcast. Take care.
Bye-bye.